today we are talking about the Cold War, right? But remember, last week we talked about World War I and World War II and the intervening years between those, and we talked about that as one long period. And I'd like to further talk about the Cold War as a part of this. So to think about the imperialist conflict. Remember, we talked about World War I and World War II as a series of imperialist conflicts over colonial possessions, and to think of the Cold War as a transformation of that conflict, especially, and one that begins not after the war ends, but towards the middle and the end of that war. So, just a quick recap of like what the thesis of yesterday or of last week was. Remember, we talked about fascism and how it grows massively in popularity, not just in Germany, not just in Italy, but across the entire industrialized world and parts of the colonized world. It takes power in many places in Italy. It takes power in Spain, Portugal, Germany, Brazil. Oh, of course. Sorry, Zoom people. Okay, you have not missed much. We're just talking about what we talked about last week, and the fact that we should be thinking about this this next stage, the Cold War, as a continuation of the imperialist conflict of World Wars I and II, right? And we talked about fascism coming around or developing in the interwar years, specifically because of a desire for the industrial class of Europe to organize a political response to communism and its political successes at the end of World War I. And the major political successes we're talking about are the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. This time, or for the Cold War, we can talk about another major success of the communist movement. That's the Chinese Revolution, or the victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, as setting the stage for the necessity of political unity among the industrial classes of Europe, right? An organized political response to this socialist movement, okay? And in the U.S. in particular, we talked about why fascism does not take hold in America, though it very well could have, at least European-style fascism, specifically because of a deliberate alliance and a deliberate welcome in, guys. A deliberate political effort among the middle classes of the United States, as well as the organized laboring classes, so that's the trade union movement especially, to work with capital and work with the middle class in the form of the Democratic Party to form what we call the New Deal coalition, right? We also call that the Popular Front in the 1930s. Then at the very end of the war, we saw the Japanese, the French, and the British empires, especially the Japanese empire, collapse in East Asia. And as you can see in kind of this photo, we talked at the end about the US invading the Japanese empire and staying there. If you look at this map and you see the places where America fought Japan across World War II from 1941 to 1945, you're going to find places where the United States military is still there today. This is when the American military presence in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, or at the time it was called Formosa, in the Philippines, or not in the Philippines, that starts earlier, but across Indonesia and lots of places starts right here. So, what are the learning objectives for today? So number one, we have to talk about and get an understanding of how early 20th century colonialism, which is really in the mold of 19th century colonialism, we call that the new imperialism of the late 1800s last week. We want to talk about how that transitions to the form of neo-colonialism we see in the world today, and the form of neo-colonialism that really defines the American empire as we know it. Then we need to talk about what the American empire looks like in a domestic context. In particular, many historians call this the post-war liberal consensus, which is a period of, let's say, overall unity among both parties, and unity among the laboring classes, the trade union movement, and capital. So we're thinking about the big corporations, U.S. Steel, Dow Chemical. These are big military industries that are connected with the military, connected with the state, and have a unique kind of a unique stability in this period, right? Where there's very little political disruption, at least until the mid 60s, late 60s, or early 70s. And then finally, we want to talk about the new political response we see to these developments. So there's this new kind of leftist movement. We're going to call it the New Left. It's a very, very broad and vague term. We're going to talk about that. But this new kind of movement that has a radically different social material base, so it's not based in the industrial working class, and has a direct discontinuity with the earlier old left, so the communist left of the 30s and 40s. And those developments, the ones that we see through the 60s and 70s, are some of the most important for understanding socialism and leftism, or at least socialist politics in the United States today, because it's basically the structure of the New Left is the structure that we have all inherited, and the dysfunctions of the New Left are the dysfunctions that we've all inherited. So, to start, we talked about how we have a completely new world after World War II, right? Last session was 1892 to 1945, and I talked about that as maybe the most traumatic 30 or 40 years in world history, in terms of the amount of things that change, the amount of big picture material changes, social changes that happen across the world, not just in any one place, but in every single corner, from Australia to Argentina, from Norway to South Africa, right? So the biggest kinds of changes we can see from that are the decline of these empires, right? So World War II in particular sends these massive shocks throughout the European empires. We can talk about the British immediately leaving India in 1947, right after the war. The British immediately leaving Palestine in 1947. The French, during the war, being kicked out of most of its Asian colonial possessions by the Japanese. After which most of those colonial possessions declared independence. This also happened to the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, right? Which immediately declared independence and is still independent today, right? So a world-spanning empire, this European empire that had existed for 200 years or so, 300 years, is now gone. And these new political entities, we're going to call them, these new decolonized states have choices to make. And they also have new conflicts to face, specifically with the United States. The United States in particular encourages these developments. So while they're setting up the international system that they set up towards the end of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union obviously are the two biggest powers, and they're the two who are most concerned with and most who have the most interest in seeing national self-determination being a massive or a principal part of the UN Charter, and having the end of colonialism, or at least let's say the formal end of colonialism, be a formal goal of both the Soviet Union and the United States. How do we see that? Well, there's lots of different ways we see it. Obviously, the U.S. Covertly does a lot during this period that we're going to talk about in a minute, but from an open perspective, we can talk about the tripartite aggression, also known as the Suez Canal crisis, right? In 1956, France, the United Kingdom, and Israel all invade Egypt after the Egyptian president nationalized the Suez Canal. And in response, we're going to watch a video about this, but in response, the United States openly disavows the actions. It says that we didn't know anything about this. We're gonna handle this entire situation through the UN. The Soviet Union and the United States issue vetoes against the British, the French, and more. So they have the British and French in particular are trying to maintain this colonial empire they have, and the US is kind of kicking them in the legs while they're doing that, because it's not very amenable to our interests at the time for there to be a British and a French empire. It's easier for us, or it's more amenable to us, it's more in our interest for us to take over in a new form of colonialism. So what is that form of colonialism? Well, last week we talked about the Bretton Woods system, which is the new kind of financial system that's set up to, let's say, stop the Great Depression from ever happening again. At the same time, many different political alliances are made, most famously NATO, right? It's the first ever proper military alliance between the United States, France, the United Kingdom, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, right? So not only is this a military alliance, but this is pretty clearly a form of political unification that Western Europe has certainly never seen before. And it's a unification that is solely under American guidance, right? Even today. I talked about how Europe is kind of irrelevant today in terms of how we make all the decisions for Europe, and Europe has to go along. because we are the head of this empire. We are the administrative center of it, and we have all the negotiating power when it comes to controlling this global system. And that power, that leverage that we have is built in this time period. Now, why does this political unity really need to be made? Well, the war is a massive crisis, and it produces these major new changes, especially in Asia, right? So in 1949, the Chinese Revolution, the Chinese Communist Revolution is officially successful. At the same time, the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, which is a Marxist-Leninist movement, frees itself from Japanese colonial rule. There are Marxist-Leninist uprisings, peasant uprisings in Korea, in Indonesia, in India at the same exact time, right? So there's this massive desire, especially in the world where there is still a large peasantry left, for a form of socialist revolution, and that is really spreading. That spread, that is what we call the domino theory, right? If you've heard about that from class. From school, there is an intense paranoia, and a justified paranoia, I would say. We talk about the Cold War as this kind of paranoia, unjustifiably, that's kind of how the liberal telling goes about this, but it's not really fair, I think, to the national security state at the time to talk about, Vietnam or China or Korea as not threats to American security interests. Because if you consider American security interests to be having full security, by security meaning military control over East Asia, communism and peasant communism in particular in Asia is a massive threat to that, right? So we're going to talk about this day, or this year, 1947, a lot today, because a lot of the major events of the early Cold War happened in 1947. One major legislation, and we'll talk about it more later, is the National Security Act. It fully reorganizes the United States intelligence apparatus in particular. For example, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, used to be called the Department of War. Today it's called the Department of Defense. This is what does that. It's a massive restructuring of that. It creates the CIA, it creates the FBI formally, it creates the National Security Council, which is a board that controls all these intelligence agencies. And all of these things have a broad permit to engage in covert military action across the world without any democratic input. That's probably the best way to describe it. And that covert military action is always targeted towards communism and things that could procedurally be considered communism. So that's mainly anti-colonial revolutions around the world. So this political unity, right, to crush communism, we don't just see it in NATO, we see it across the world. There's the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which ends up including Taiwan or the Republic of China, Japan, all sorts of East Asian nations. There's the Central Treaty Organization, which includes Iran under the Shah, Pakistan under a military junta, Iraq before a revolution in Iraq, and a few other central places in the Middle East. So basically, we're seeing a new form of political unity specifically designed to stop this global peasant uprising, right? So in response to this moment, every single colonized country is faced with three options. We're going to call them the white revolution, a green revolution, and a red revolution. Obviously, a red revolution is the Chinese style of revolution. It's a style of total transformation, of total change, one that is ultimately extremely anti-imperialist in nature, and is deeply opposed by the Western establishment. Then we have the White Revolution. Now, the White Revolution in particular refers to Iran under the Shah, but I'm going to use it more as a catch-all for all these different kinds of programs that a lot of monarchies and dictatorships in particular are implementing across Latin America and Asia. So the White Revolution is best described as a reformist trend towards liberalizing an economy, which means industrializing, providing more liberal rights. So in Iran, that means giving the vote to women for the first time. That means adding ethnic minority protections, religious protections. It means allowing some press freedom. It means allowing peasants to start voting, all these kinds of things. And all of this is geared towards creating a stronger central government in Iran, but this is the exact same process happens in Argentina, the exact same process happens in Pakistan, all of which are strong allies of the United States in this period. And this is a movement that the United States deeply supports, because it's seen as kind of taking out the legs of Maoism and of Marxism-Leninism across Asia, because it removes, or it's supposed to remove, many of the conditions that create these revolutions. Now, in this exact same vein, at this time period, we have the Green Revolution. Now, the Green Revolution is probably one of the most important material changes that happens in this time period. It's a massive industrialization of the agrarian economy across the world. The introduction of new fertilizers, the introduction of tractors and mechanization into agriculture everywhere. Now, these had been introduced into European agriculture in the early 1900s, but this is the time period where it's being put into India and Pakistan and China. And there's a competition, really. There's a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States to see who is going to help these countries solve these agricultural problems first. And it's this competition that allows certain nations, like India, to play the Soviet Union and the United States off of each other. So the India, for example, receives lots and lots of economic aid and military aid from the Soviet Union, but in the process of the Green Revolution, it receives tractors and fertilizers and agricultural technical support, right? A lot of this is just sending scientists over and stuff like that. You know, human capital is really important. So let's say these tensions, we'll call them, these tensions between how are we going to stop this red revolution from happening? Are we going to do it by industrializing? Are we going to do it by becoming some kind of quasi-socialist government, which is what India becomes under the Indian National Congress and Jawaharlal Nehru? Every single country on planet Earth is dealing with these exact same conditions and exact same choices. They all have this choice. You can become a dictatorship. You can try to do some kind of liberal democracy, but you have to take a side here. You cannot. You can hold in the middle, but you have to make a decision in the middle, right? That's what I'm trying to say here. And finally, I just want to let you guys know that this unique moment, right? This is a truly unique moment in American history, because not just in American history, in global history. No country has ever in history had as much wealth proportionally to the world economy as the United States did in 1950. Okay, I have a stat here in the notes that say 60% of all global manufacturing that happens in the world, I mean, that's obvious, global. 60% of all global manufacturing is happening in the United States in 1950. Now, we think about China as the biggest industrial power in the world today, right? And about how much global manufacturing is happening there. At the height of the Chinese industrial economy, right, which is not even right now in terms of, it was more like 10 years ago, China was accounting for 30%, max, and those are the highest estimates for how much manufacturing is happening in China. So that means if you want socks, if you want coats, if you want weapons, if you want automobiles, 80 to 90% of all automobiles or any kind of engine is being made in the United States in this period. So if you're wondering why the United States is able to do this, not only are the European empires falling, but we exist in a uniquely privileged position to not only do these massive social programs at home, you know, the Medicaid and Medicare and all this kind of stuff, but also expand our military state immensely, right? For Europe to produce the national healthcare system in England, to produce those big pensions that, you know, they're always talking about in France, they had to destroy their empires. They had to cut military spending like crazy. It was the only way they could do that. But the opposite happens in America, where we expand entitlements, we expand welfare like crazy during this time period, and at the exact same time, we stimulate our military-industrial complex to unheard of levels. And the final thing I want to say about that is that because of how paramount that is, we have to understand that that is a unique moment. And every moment from that peak is going to be less and less. It's going to be less and less and less, and with every single decrease or every single destabilization of this system, it becomes harder and harder to control contradictions, to control conflict within American society, but also to maintain American neo-colonial control over the entire world. And that's kind of the story of the Cold War. Is America starting extremely strong and hitting crisis in the middle, and then finding a new, let's say, a new gasp of life through neoliberalism. That we'll talk about more next week, but that's what we want to understand. Now, and from an American perspective, I think the most important thing to understand about the Cold War is that it completely and totally changes the nature of foreign policy in this country. And by foreign policy, I mean the military. Who controls the military? Who controls the intelligence agencies? What are they doing? Is that public knowledge? Because before the 1940s or 50s, the idea that the military would be doing anything secret, that anything in the State Department would be doing something secret without the knowledge of the American public was so taboo in American society that it could lose you an election, it could cause a revolt in certain places, right? It's considered, it's still considered, legally it's still a major part of the Constitution that the American people are supposed to have some kind of say over military matters. And after World War II, that is functionally not the case anymore. We're going to war, we're funding war, we're doing war all the time without anybody's knowledge. And more so than that, we're doing it without even our own government's knowledge. Right? So I have Kennedy up here, and I'm not gonna really get into this, but the CIA definitely killed Kennedy, all right? And a part of this is because while Kennedy is not some like anti-imperialist socialist revolutionary, he is a liberal. He is definitely a liberal, and he has a vision of a liberal internationalist system that the CIA definitely is not a fan of. And because of the way the National Security Act works, the fact that it has secret orders, the fact that it is literally a cabal within the government, and it's not, which has no elected representatives. It's not until the 70s or 80s that after all of this stuff, that the CIA even has to report anything it does to the legislative branch, right? So, you know, I don't love the term, but we're talking about a deep state here, right? And under that, a lot of tricky things can be enacted for the wishes of capital, right? In our notes, I talk about who really founds the CIA, and I say that probably the biggest avatar of the CIA in this time period is Allen Dulles, who's the first leader of it until the early 60s, who's fired by Kennedy, and who is then put in charge of the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's death. And his brother, John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower and Truman, they essentially create Cold War policy in the United States until the 70s, when it switches over to people like Nixon and Kissinger, right? These guys are all Yale, Princeton, and Harvard lawyers. That's where they all come from. They're all part. What am I trying to explain here? Whatever like secret conspiracy theory thing you can think of in terms of who these guys are, you're really not like thinking enough about how bad it is for these guys. It is very much a boys' club. It's very much a small collection of people within the U.S. government who know each other from school, who work directly for Wall Street. Allen Dulles was a Wall Street banker for most of his life, and a lawyer for Wall Street until he became a politician. So these internal structures of the government, the FBI, right, also created in this time period, and the CIA, they engage in massive counterintelligence operations. That's what COINTELPRO actually is. That's what the acronym for it is. And I'm certain a lot of us haven't heard about COINTELPRO in some way. It's a massive organization. The actual acronym COINTELPRO refers to the FBI program, but nowadays we kind of use that to talk about everything the U.S. security state was doing at this time period. But the major thing to understand is that COINTELPRO is a political operation. It's designed to attack American political actors. And formally, under some, how do I say, to the press, to the president even, to Congress, this is only supposed to be targeting the American Communist Party, which is still, to this day, even though it is, still even through the 60s and 70s, despite how weak it is, despite how infiltrated it is still seen as the #1 threat to the American state. And therefore, the vast majority of resources is spent towards fighting the American Communist Party, and that's a largely public fight, right? But what people get outraged by is when the COINTELPRO files are leaked. There's an interesting story about that with some young revolutionaries breaking into the FBI offices. I'm certain a lot of people have heard that story. That happened during the George Foreman, Muhammad Ali fight, the Rumble in the Jungle, and apparently everybody was out to watch that. when those files come out, they realize that this is not just a war on communism, right? Though that is the #1 war it is. It's also a war against the entire civil rights movement. It's a war against the entire labor rights movement. Every single level of union leadership, the trade unions are attacked at this time, right? In 1947, there's the Taft-Hartley Act, which I have up here as well. Taft-Hartley is considered one of the death knells for American militant labor action, let's say. It completely, it outlaws many of the most militant strike tactics, the most militant labor organizing tactics, and more than that, it represents a specific moment within the Democratic Party, because if you don't know, Harry Truman vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, and the entire Democratic Party at this time period uses their votes to override Harry Truman's veto to get Taft-Hartley passed. And that's because at this point, at least towards the end of the war, the Democratic Party has engaged in a thorough purging of the communist and socialist influences that created the New Deal coalition in the early 30s. And from this period, this liberal consensus that we're talking about is going to hold. And what is that consensus? The #1 consensus is labor unions are going to crush communism for us. They're going to shed their communist past, which means they're going to purge all the communists from the AFL-CIO boards. They're going to arrest people, etc. They're going to do that. They're going to support imperialism totally, which means they're going to support Korea. They're going to support Korea. They're going to support the Vietnam War totally. We're going to talk about that more, about how big of a deal it is that trade unions in this country. This is not a thing trade unions are normally known to be doing across the world, is being totally for war. But in America, the military-industrial complex throughout the 60s becomes one of the largest economic drivers in the country, and it produces good, stable, paying industrial jobs for unions in this country. So that's the pact. You crush communism, you support imperialism, and we'll give you jobs, and we'll give you social welfare. And in return, you don't revolt, you don't do this, and we'll get along fine. A lot of this comes crumbling down towards the 70s. #1 is, COINTELPRO comes out, Watergate comes out. I don't want to talk too much about Watergate because we'll get into a whole thing about it, but what you got to know about Watergate is that the American public did not know that this shit was happening, right? And Watergate brings it all out. It leads to the resignation of a president, and it really fundamentally destroys, in my opinion, the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party does not get away from the deep scandal of this. It's considered it's both a Republican and a Democratic thing, and it leads to this coalescence around conservatism under the Reagan administration in the late 70s, right? So let's keep going. What are the other parts of this liberal consensus, right? The major parts are civil rights and the Great Society. Now, the Great Society actually refers to both things together, but I'm gonna talk about the civil rights, the social rights aspect of this, and the economic rights aspect of this. So. Obviously, this time period is defined by social revolution in America and across the world. And the first and foremost way we learn about this in school is through the civil rights movement, right? And we talked 2 sessions ago about the start of the civil rights movement. We talked about the development of a black middle class in this country, of lawyers' guilds, of organizations like the NAACP, which are focused towards reformist, legalist action against the state. The NAACP's first major programs are to pass I believe it's called the Dwyer anti-lynching bill, which never passes the Senate or Congress, but it's the big fight that everybody's going for. Actually, there was never an anti-lynching bill put into actual law, in effect, until a few years ago. And that's the major fight that the NAACP is engaging in. Later on, we get the Southern Baptist Leadership Conference. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. officially heads up, which starts taking more direct action, nonviolent action, economically important as the North, right? And so the Democratic Party is happy to lose that. The Republican Party, in turn, is happy to gain that support. And we'll talk about that next week in terms of how Reagan wins such a huge electoral margin in the 80s through the Southern strategy and things like that. But we can think of these two things: the amazing expansion of social welfare programs in Johnson's Great Society, and all of this gets elaborated way more in the guided notes, right? So I'm trying to go through my guided notes and also trying not to say every single thing about every single thing, right? But I definitely want to say everything, right? A lot of the staples of the welfare state are made in this time period, whether that's Medicaid, whether that's tuition. This is the time period where the vast majority of Americans are for the first time going to college. Another big thing. We'll talk. I have a song to show you about that later. So that's the pact, right? That's what we're talking about. That's the pact. We're gonna have social rights for these super exploited minorities within the United States. That's gonna help stabilize the situation, and we're gonna expand social welfare. We're not gonna expand trade union participation, right? But we are gonna expand social welfare, which is a key trade union demand at this time. Okay, so there has to be a political response to this change in American politics, right? The post-war liberal consensus, that's what we're calling it, right? Totally defangs what we're going to call the old left, right? The old communist left, the left that is based directly within the trade union movement, is based within labor organizing. Taft-Hartley is one of the final death knells in this, but there are also many decisions made within the Communist Party of the United States, but also communist politics across the entire world, right? In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev, who's the premier of the Soviet Union, gives a speech to the deputies of the Soviet Union, denouncing Stalinism and this. We don't need to talk about like why all this stuff happens, but we do need to know is this like destroys lots of the old left across the entire world. It produces massive splits across the Italian Communist Party, across the Iraqi Communist Party. The Indian Communist Party goes through a massive thing during this period. A few years later, the Soviet Union invades Hungary, which also creates another equally big, massive split within the old left. We gotta remember that a big reason why this paranoia exists within the American establishment in this period is because the communist left, in the wake of World War II, is remarkably united. The Soviet Union has, emerged victorious. The communist partisans across France, across Italy, across the Balkans, across Greece have emerged victorious and are the most popular actors in the country. There's a very real sense, at least within communist circles, if you read what communists are writing, there's a very real sense that communism is about to come, and that we're on the upswing, and that these European empires they got themselves into two big wars and they've done messed up a big time, right? But that's not what happens. And a big part of that is these major splits that end up happening through the communist movement. First through the Khrushchev era, Khrushchev's invasion of the Soviet Union. Then there's a massive split within the communist movement through the Sino-Soviet split. Happens for very complex reasons. But the important thing to get is that these are all things that the entire left across the world is having to deal with at the time. Because as we talked about last week, this is the period of a fully globalized world, and everybody is connected, and and these political consequences are pushing on each other, right? And so you have these failures of the old left, these structural failures, but also these like contingent failures. By contingent, I just mean like they fucked up and they should have done something different, right? In response, a new generation comes up, right? A generation that has discontinuity. And by discontinuity, I mean this new generation of new left people, their fathers and mothers are not like old communists, right? These are people who are coming around and gaining a kind of radical liberal consciousness, but they are not the next generation of the old communists, right? They have their own unique ideas, they have their own desires, and more than anything else, they are growing up in the shadow of the civil rights movement, of the end of the labor rights movement, right? These people, the new left has a massive hesitance or reluctance to engage in labor organizing of any kind. Because at this point, the trade unions are totally for the Vietnam War. And the new left has no desire, the new left's only existence, the only purpose it has for existing by the late 60s is to stop the Vietnam War. It's what everybody is doing. And if the trade union movement, which is the traditional political organ of the communist left, it still is in lots of the world, still is today, and in the 60s even more so. The Italian Communist Party, the Portuguese Communist Party, the French Communist Party, totally and completely dependent on its trade union roots. And if the trade unions are totally for this war that's drafting your brothers and your roommates and your classmates and stuff like that, then a very unique kind of ideology of student revolutionary action, not just student revolutionary action, but the vast majority of the new left is based within within student circles. And that's not just true in America, by the way. The big thing that's really hanging over the new left is the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which happens throughout the 1960s, right? And it's where a lot of the new left gets its main ideas. This a kind of complete rejection of authority, of bureaucracy, of things like that. That's why, like, a lot of the big new left figures call themselves Maoists. They read Mao's Little Red Book, and they take part in these really minute, and I really do mean minute theoretical differences between pro-Soviet parties and pro-Chinese parties, and these things just eat away at the old left first, and then the new left, as the new left continues to grow. And I want to stress that this doesn't just happen in America. This also happens in India, for example, right? If you've ever heard of the Naxalite Maoist movement in India, it's made in this exact time period for the exact same reason. Oh, I don't know what happened there. But for the exact same reason, in that there's an old left based in the trade union movement that doesn't want to do revolution right now, and there's a new left that really wants to do a revolution right now. And they got to come to some kind of they got to come to a middle ground of some kind, and they can't. So the new left kind of retreats into a certain kind of if you can, I don't know if they can hear me, if you can turn on your mic, a form of guerrilla culture, right? So in 1959 at the end of 1959, the Cuban Revolution is successful, and a new form of socialist revolutionary action develops. Specifically by Che Guevara, but it's really more of a, it's more of a broad, oh, that's why my internet is not working. It's a broad development that's happening across Latin America and across even Europe, Africa, and in the Middle East, right? Officially, that's called, we call that theory Foco theory or Foquismo, which basically refers to a small group of highly motivated, highly educated individuals recognizing that the material conditions for revolution are not there, but deciding, or at least theoretically believing, that they can incite or spark revolution, right, through the coordinated and dynamic, let's say, actions of a small group of people. And what's nice about that, or at least the nice thing about this is it means you don't really have to rely on trade unions, right, to do anything. If a small group of people, which, let's say the amount of soldiers that land in Cuba on the I forget what the actual day they landed in Cuba, but on the Granma, the boat they landed on, was something like 200 soldiers, and 180 of them die within one day, right? And so really 20 highly committed guerrillas take over the Cuban government. And that inspires a lot of people across the world, right? And you can name 100 different groups that take, guerrilla groups that take direct inspiration from Castro and Che Guevara throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they are trying to put this theory into action. So I need to unmute myself. They're trying to put this theory into action, and the American Communist movement, or the American Socialist movement, the American Leftist movement, whatever we're going to call it, because they themselves don't really know what to call it at this time period, right? Whatever we're going to call it, they take that as guidance. They move away from the trade union movement, even if they don't engage in military action, though many of them do. The Black Liberation Army exists in this time period. The Weather Underground, which comes out from students, from members of the Students for a Democratic Society, which is one of the major New Left organs on university campuses. They try to engage in revolutionary action. There's the Italian Red Brigades at this time period, who killed the Italian Prime Minister. There's the Red Army faction in Germany, which kidnaps multiple politicians, do all these kinds of bombings all over the place, right? And these people all know each other, they all talk to each other. The Red Army faction trains directly with the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Jordan. The BLA trains directly with the PLO in Jordan. So they're all trying to do this global revolution, but they continuously find that they have very little mass support in America. Why? Well, we talked about it. There's this pact. We don't need to fight imperialism. Imperialism gives us jobs at the defense plant, right? So there's very little material need to do this, and there's also it's also not in your material interests to do this. Not only could you die, obviously, but you could also lose everything that you fought for the last 20 years, and you decrease America's ability to project power over the world. I've got a YouTube clip or a movie clip to show that kind of goes into some of this thinking maybe, but I think it really succinctly explains some of how, especially the right wing in America, viewed the New Left and viewed the liberalism in general at this time period. And I think the big thing to get at is that this is a very conservative time period in American history. And unfortunately, America's only going to get more conservative every single decade going forward, essentially. But what do I mean by conservative? I mean that it is, there is very little political opposition to anything that is happening in American politics throughout the late 40s, 50s, early 60s, even the late 60s, early 70s, right? The US invades Vietnam, and that's the largest war America fights since World War II and since Vietnam, right? So something like 60,000 American soldiers died within a very short amount of time, right? Because American troops really are not doing a lot of fighting in Vietnam for a lot of time. They're like, let's say the height of the war is from like 1965 to 1969, and that's when the draft is really going. And that's when the vast majority of the New Left opposition to the war actually comes from, the draft. And without the draft, the New Left, especially on university campuses, collapses completely post-1969, post-70. Richard Nixon promises to withdraw American forces from Vietnam in during the 1968 elections, or he basically says, I'm going to win the war. And most people take that to mean we're going to get out somehow. And then in the second election in 1972, he wins again, also historic margins, and that's when he says we're going to get out of it. But the important thing to get is that the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of American workers are very supportive of the Vietnam War. Very supportive of the Vietnam War. Even with the draft, the vast majority of American soldiers are not drafted into the war, are voluntary enlisted recruits. Even among even among combat troops who are more likely to be drafted, because most people who sign up choose not to go into a combat unit, right? Even among those people, the vast majority of them are enlisted, and more than anything, this is also a time period where the American military doctrine changes towards being focused on these special forces who are all highly trained, highly motivated, and they're completely of their own volition, right? So that's how America's fighting this war, and what that really means is this has very little effect on the American populace at the time. In our cultural memory, we remember Vietnam as being this extremely big thing, and it was, culturally. It produced many big cultural landstones. It has a lot of great music, right? A lot of great music was made from Vietnam, but very few people actually in America saw big material changes because of that war, and because of that, the New Left loses its reason to exist, right? Its only purpose in the late 60s is to end this war, and most people don't even really need the war to end, or don't care about the war enough, and then the war ends, and the American military has completely changed. We're never going to have a draft again, at least from what we can see right now and from what they could see at the time. So the impetus for so much of what's happening in this time period just kind of falls away. And why does it fall away? Well, remember, these people are mainly students, and I was a student, and I don't know if you remember, but we're not thinking long term, and we're thinking much more about what can we do right now? What can we do right now? And that's not what the Bolshevik left. That's not how they thought of those things. They thought in very long time periods. They thought in terms of long-term guerrilla struggle sometimes. If you read Lenin, if you read Trotsky, whoever you read, right? They're always talking about waiting for conditions to be right, never ever jumping the gun on anything because that's the death knell for any movement, et cetera, et cetera. But as we talked about, the New Left isn't even in contact with the Old Left, right? They don't even know each other because they didn't grow up in the same places. They're coming from radically different places. The Old Left is based in this trade union movement. The New Left is based in the universities, and they have very little contact with each other. They're completely disunited, so they have completely different political purposes and political action, therefore, right? And I think it's important to recognize that even today, even still to this day, we are so reliant on student activism, student revolutionary politics because of the New Left. I was a part of SJP, you know, like 1 or 2 years ago or something, and we always talked about like the Colombia occupation in 1968. We talked about the Vietnam War as like our way of thinking about how to fight American imperialism. Whatever, you know, it was difficult. It's difficult to think in these long-term directions, especially when you're trying to fight something and respond to something right now. You don't have a lot of options to do it, right? That's something I'm trying to get across with all these sessions, is that people can make seemingly irrational choices out of very real material interests because they view it as a necessity to take these actions right now, and they also believe, even irrationally, but to them perfectly rationally, that this will help their material interests. Okay, now, so what did we talk about today? And I'm so sorry because this is my favorite time period in American history and world history, and I left out so much. We didn't get to talk about anything real cool about this period, but what did we talk about? Okay, so this is the time period with the British, French, the Dutch, the Belgian, every empire you can think of collapses, right? The last British and the last European colonies in, what's it called? In Asia are Hong Kong by the British in 1999, Macau, which is also in China, by the Portuguese in 1999, get let over. The last states in Africa are decolonized. In Portuguese Africa are decolonized in the mid-70s. South Africa decolonizes its apartheid system in around 1991, right? So that's the story of the Cold War. The story of the Cold War is these collapsing empires. And remember, this is the British Empire. That's the largest empire in human history. And within the span of like 20 years, it's gone. So that's a massive change, and it has all these big political consequences. Exact same thing with the French Empire. Most of West Africa still speaks French to this day, right? They were all there for decades, sometimes centuries. In India's case, the British were there for almost 300 years, right? And so each one of these countries are trying to deal with that, and they are negotiating power with the new global hegemon in the US. And why are they negotiating power? Because as we said, if you want 60% of anything made, you need to talk to the United States about it, right? And because of this stress that's happening, because the British Empire is collapsing, because the French Empire, the Dutch Empire is collapsing, European capital really needs a new form of political unity, right? They saw how World War II went, they saw how World War I went, they saw, really, if anything, they saw how the Great Depression went, and they view that as mainly caused by their political and economic disunity. And that's why they create Bretton Woods, that's why they create the IMF, the World Bank, that's why they create that's why they make the US dollar, the global reserve currency, etc., etc. And then they have political and military unity under the form of NATO, right? And we think of NATO as a military alliance, and it is a military alliance, but what does a military alliance actually mean? If you have like complete and total security cooperation between states, can you really call those things two different states at that point? If your entire military, if your entire security apparatus is intertwined? I think that's probably one of the biggest theses to get across here, is that Europe, France, America, the UK kind of ceased to be independent cultural and economic entities and merge into this like Western culture. And that's a Western American-centered culture. And that's why throughout the 60s and 70s, what music are Germans listening to? It's the Beatles, and it's the Rolling Stones, and it's American rock and roll. That's why. It's because this is one new political entity that is not based on those old national boundaries. We talked about why this political division needs to happen. The U.S. needs to maintain this unique dominance, right? This amazing kind of power it has in this moment, but it also has a massive threat, right? Before the Sino-Soviet split, the communist world is very united, and it looks like they're going to win, right? China comes in. China, that's the largest country on planet Earth, has a massive revolution. There's a very real chance that India is going to fall to revolution. There's a very real chance that Bangladesh, or East Pakistan at the time, which is one of the hearts of the communist movement, is going to fall to revolution. Indonesia, largest communist party in the world outside of the Soviet Union and China. Korea, you know, we have a whole war over it. Iraq is one of the largest communist parties in the world. So there's a very real threat here. And the other thing is that these aren't isolated movements. Before the New Left, every one of these communist parties is part of the Comintern, or the Communist International, which we talked about last week. And so, in a very real way, there is an international communist conspiracy. I have a video that's going to talk about that. But I want you guys to get that, like, the way these people talk about this does not seem so irrational if you take that into perspective. And then finally, we talked about the New Left, this global movement that fails, but fails especially in America, right? Because of what we talked about, that complete disunity with the old labor organizing tradition, the complete reliance of the New Left, and the left of today, because the left of today is not in discontinuity, is in continuity with the New Left, where the New Left broke with the old left, but we have not yet broken with the New Left, is what I'm saying. And that failure, especially in America, is what really leaves the stage for neoliberalism, which comes around under Reagan in America, under Thatcher in the United Kingdom, to face basically zero political opposition. And it's in that time period, which we'll talk about next week, where this post-war liberal consensus completely falls apart. And you get, we'll call it the total and complete unchallenged rule of capital, of financial capital, through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And that's the world we're still living in. And the failure of the New Left, and the failure of every single leftist movement that came out of the New Left to address that is, in my opinion, the fundamental issue of the socialist left in the world today, right? It's what every single person, and anywhere. You go to India, they're talking about the exact same thing. They're talking about, oh shit, why did this have to happen in 1968? You go to Pakistan, all the leftists are always just talking about, well, why did they have to make this decision in the early 70s? Because it totally fucked us and we're still dealing with it today. I'm cursing too much today, I'm sorry. But yeah, that is what we talked about today, all right?